So today's episode discussion video is going to address probably one of the key things that people want to know about dry fasting when they hear about it, because the first thought that comes to your mind is always, how am I going to survive without water? Don't I need water daily or I'll die? Well, the answer is no. Although there are nuances to it. And dry fasting is intense. People worry about dehydration. So we're going to talk about how our body actually creates its own water. And the official name for that is metabolic water, or scientists can refer to it as endogenous water. So water that our body creates. The first step on this crazy journey is to understand that you won't die in 3 days if you stop drinking water. At least the vast majority of the world's population won't. And obviously, that changes if you have some sort of underlying illnesses, something that maybe doesn't let you burn your fat properly. Maybe you have contraindicated illnesses like severe heart problems or blood disorders that you'd have to really watch out for. I'm not saying you can't dry fast with them, but I'm saying that you really have to watch out, and you should do it under medical supervision. And of course, if you're running marathons or traveling the Gobi Desert, then maybe you shouldn't be dry fasting. Other than that, you're a pretty solid candidate, so go at it. Today, I'm going to try and persuade you through the use of a study that actually observed dry fasting conditions in zebra finches, which are these birds that that live in different environments and have to travel across deserts sometimes during their migratory flights. We know that they have to sometimes survive in very desperate conditions, but usually throughout the years, scientists have had this conclusion, or they have concluded that metabolic water is usually driven through protein catabolism. And it was not a known fact that it was actually through fat. It was this study that flipped everything on its head and showed us that we were wrong, assuming it was protein, because it was almost irrefutable that it was fat driving the water production. And here I actually have a quote from one of the papers. Water availability is essential for fasting birds to maintain their fat stores. And the team says, we revise currently established views that protein catabolism is the main source of metabolic water, and propose that fat serves as the primary source for metabolic water production. So that was really cool. And that comes from an article called Thirsty Zebra Finches Burn Fat for Hydration. So why is a 3-day dry fast safe? Why won't we die in 3 days without water? That idea that's been thrown around and sort of hammered into our heads ever since we were yay high growing up in school. Well, it's quite simple. Our body creates its own water. We just talked about that. And not only do we have built-in capabilities for making our own water, but we also have internal cellular mechanisms, autophagy, and molecules like osmolytes to protect us from stressors associated with dehydration. All of this is really cool, and I'll touch on some of these topics a little bit, but if you want to go deeper, I highly recommend that you read some of my other articles, the ones specifically that talk about osmolytes, hypertonic, hyperosmotic stress, maybe structured water, and anything around water, to get a better understanding. So before we jump into that study, I think that this is a good opportunity to very quickly touch on structured water and how much water our body creates. So what is structured water? Well, basically, think of the water in our body as either being structured or unstructured. Here's an image that actually shows this so that it paints a clearer picture of what it can look like. And the idea is that structured water is much better for us metabolically in all aspects, from aging to metabolic health to even things like cancer cells. I have a blurb here that says studies suggest that not just adding osmolytes, but also creating a state of hyperosmolarity, which is basically dehydration, inside of cells could be beneficial. This state is thought to remove disorganized water from cells and encourage the absorption of osmolytes. This change could help restore normal cell functions, especially in cancer cells. The idea is to shift from a disorganized and organized water inside the cell. This shift might bring back a balanced and orderly state in the cell's energy system. Basically, the structured water is most likely created during a dry fast because your body is creating water from its own fat cells. And this is structured water, and it's not polluted or contaminated by everything else that normal water can go through, especially tap water. And honestly, we get a lot of our water from even the food that we consume, the drinks that we drink, and all of that is contaminated to a certain degree. Some of them may be contaminated with beneficial minerals, but a lot of other things play into the process. But our body creates that pure water that people are in search of. They search for it with things like deuterium depleted water. They search for good water with things like hydrogen water. There's water ionization and even things related around zeta potential, which you can look into a little bit deeper if you want to look and go down that rabbit hole. And what about how much water is created during this whole process? And I have an article on this called How Much Water Does the Body Produce from Burning Fat During Fasting, which is fat oxidation. And I highly recommend you take a look, but here's a little blurb out of that. When we fast, our body turns to stored fat for energy, a process known as fat oxidation. This isn't just about energy, it's also about water production. The chemical equation for fat oxidation can provide some insights. So then I go into this organic chemistry equation, and I use palmitic acid as an example because it's one of the most common fatty acids found in the body. So of course it's going to be metabolized, and it's a good example. Basically, it combines with oxygen, and then the reaction of fat and oxygen, which is fat oxidation, gives us carbon dioxide and H2O. And then when you actually do all of the calculations, it comes out to approximately 1.12 grams of water for every gram of fat, which is amazing because that means that we get a surplus of water. It's not a 1-to-1 ratio, it's a higher ratio. When we actually look at water potential coming out of a gram of protein, it's actually negative. It's under a gram. So you need to provide a gram of protein and get, I forget if it was 0.9 or 0.7 grams of water. So you can see that it's not an efficient conversion and why fat is the key to water production in our bodies. Okay, I know I'm jumping around a little bit. Maybe I'm talking too fast. I'm going to slow it down as we get into the actual study that I wanted to talk about. And this study is called Increased Fat Catabolism Sustains Water Balance During Fasting in Zebra Finches. And before we actually dive into this, there's going to be so many people that are going to jump on me and say things like, oh, these are zebra finches, they're not humans. You can't make the same correlations. And I agree, we are not zebra finches. But me and you and so many other people take into consideration thousands of studies that are based on rats, mice, worms, planarians when it comes to longevity and fasting. So excuse me for bringing zebra finches into the conversation. Birds and humans are part of the animal kingdom, which means we share a common ancestor. Our lipolysis mechanisms, which is fat, are similar and are regulated by the same hormones. For example, adrenaline and glucagon promote fat catabolism in both birds and humans. Both humans and birds store fat as a source of energy. Both of us use lipase to break down fats, and we both break them down into fatty acids and glycerol. So it means that fat metabolic pathways must have been conserved to some degree across both species for millions of years. Hopefully that's enough to convince you that there is some benefit to making correlation between this study and potentially beneficial to the nth degree for humans as well. So how is this experiment actually set up? It's kind of beautiful how the researchers approached it. They were very meticulous and detail-oriented. The researchers accounted for light exposure in this experiment, which I don't see in a lot of other studies, but which I believe is very important. They gave them 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of lights off, and also kept the lab at a consistent temperature of around 30 degrees Celsius, which is the thermoneutral condition for zebra finches. What I like about the fact they controlled for light is that the scientific community is slowly and finally becoming more and more aware of the reason why testing for light conditions is very important in animal experiments. Things like circadian rhythm influence, behavioral impact, like mood, foraging, mating behavior, and even different wavelengths of light. And those different wavelengths can stimulate vitamin synthesis, immune system, and so much more. All of these things play a big factor. It's also important to mimic natural environments as best as possible, especially when doing animal studies, and that has to include light exposure. The researchers also caught them at different times, put them in cages, even gave them slight dry fasting, slight water fasting conditions to kind of switch it up, adapt the birds to a certain degree so that when they actually did the study, they could remove the possibility of acute stress shock having a big impact on the results. So I really love that. So summarized, what they did was they divided the birds into groups. You had a control group, a water fasting group, and a dry fasting group. They checked their weights, they calculated everything, and at the end, they had to euthanize the birds, dried them out, and looked at their organs, their lean mass, collected the amount of fat that was left on the birds, and their energy and water expenditure could be calculated from all of that, which was great. Now, inside the article, I have the actual table. I guess I should have scrolled down here a little bit. We have this table here called the effects of food and water availability on body composition. And these are the actual numbers. I actually took these numbers and I plugged them in. I pulled out percentages and I made my own table, which I'll get to in a little bit. But we can look here and see some of these results. And at a cursory glance, we can see they've taken the averages and plotted them on a graph. And we can see that just specifically mass of the birds, we see that the control group obviously maintained their mass. It's fine. They were under completely normal conditions. You don't expect much there. The water fasting group lost a lot of weight. They dropped from almost 14 to maybe 13.4. Remember, these birds are very light. So 1 gram of difference is like 10% of a difference. So in human terms, that would be like 10 to 20 pounds, which is crazy. But obviously the dry fasting group lost the most weight. And when we look at the water content, we see that the control group actually has slightly lower water content in the carcass. And that is wild because you would expect the fasting birds to actually have less water. Maybe the water fasting groups would have the most, which we actually see up here. We see that they actually have the highest water content. But then we see the dry fasting birds are basically almost even with the control group. And that is wild. Then when they looked at lean dry mass, that was fantastic too. We actually saw that the water fasting and dry fasting group basically lost the same amount of muscle. And if you really wanted to nitpick, it would actually seem that the dry fasting group lost less muscle than the water fasting group. And then when we look at total body fat, this is where things get ridiculous. The water fasting group barely lost any weight after 24 hours. But the dry fasting group actually lost a tremendous amount of fat. And when we look at the actual fat loss later in the article, we'll talk about the actual numbers. As we come down here, here's the table that I put together. And you can take a look in the article to print it out or to see it better. But then I subdivided that into categories so that we can talk about it a little bit more. And we have this weight loss and water content. And we see that the final mass changes the most for the dry fasting group. That's fine. Doesn't tell us a lot, but it correlates to our own dry fasting experiences and the idea that you lose a ton of weight, especially on the first 24 to 48 hours of a dry fast. So you can expect the scale to really plummet. But you also have to remember that a lot of it is water weight. However, this study has shown us that there is a lot of fat loss even in just 24 hours happening during a dry fast. So that's something to take into consideration. And then obviously we see the water content is crazy because the birds actually had a higher water content while fasting than during regular conditions. And now as we go to fat burn, we start to see that there was a huge discrepancy. It's amazing how much more fat was lost. So we have 26.9% more fat lost. And remember, that is the percentage of how much more was lost from dry fasting compared to water fasting. So actually, off of the control group, water fasting only lost about 1%, whereas dry fasting lost 28% of their total fat. So yes, I'm sure that zebra finches have a more efficient fat burning metabolism relative to their body size than we do. But just this idea paints a picture of how powerful a dry fast can be for fat loss. And just in terms of zebra finches, we see that in 24 hours, dry fasting burned almost 20 times the amount of fat than the water fasting group. What does this show us? Well, basically, we have to think about it in terms of ketosis. Ketosis is when the body's actually burning fat, so it creates ketones. We know this. That's the basis of the ketogenic diet and of all fasting. However, we also know that glycogen needs to be depleted. So you have to be in a nutrient starvation period for your glycogen to get used up by the body so that it actually starts to enter ketosis and burn fat. But to burn fat this quickly tells us that ketosis can occur through other means than just nutrient deprivation. And here we're being shown that our bodies activate ketosis in dehydration as well as calorie restriction. What does this mean? That there are methods to autophagy that science hasn't even touched on. I hope you're as flabbergasted as I am just reading this, because the revelations here are insane. We knew on an intrinsic level that this was true. That's why we dry fast. That's why you're a weirdo who loves this fast. And not just because it makes you feel better and have more energy, and we can explain that in science, but because you knew that these weird claims that weren't even really backed by science were fantastic, and you believed in the power of the dry fast. And here we have evidence to show why those beliefs were correct. And if you want to look into another video that I did, it's called The Science Behind How a One-Day Dry Fast is Equivalent to a 3-Day Water Fast in Raw Autophagic Power. That's a great article, and it talks about a completely different research paper that tracked autophagy levels in the brain on a dry fast, and it actually tracked it up to either day 3 or day 4 of a dry fast. It wasn't meant to be for dry fasting. It was just one of the extra conditions that the researchers measured for. And it is a fantastic paper and also gives us more insight and science behind how dry fasting is so powerful. Now, lean mass. Lean mass is interesting. It's interesting because it is not interesting. It's interesting because the results are almost the same. And you're going to say, oh, whatever. No, that's insane, because we just looked at fat burn. So for the same amount of time, we lose the same amount of muscle, but burn infinitesimally more fat. Put that together, and what do you get? You get something magical, especially for weight loss. And this is probably why not just my protocol, but a lot of other people talk about things like 36-hour dry fasts on a weekly, bi-weekly, maybe monthly basis for weight loss. You do not have to do these insane long dry fasts to have a very powerful weight loss protocol. You just need to learn how to dry fast for short bursts properly. And that type of efficiency is going to change your life. Okay, and one of the last categories that we're going to talk about here is metabolic water and energy expenditure. And here we see that the second column in all of these is the dry fasting group, and the first one, the dark one, is the water fasting group. And we can see that, for example, for metabolic water production, we can see that energy from protein is about the same, and it makes sense. Energy from protein and water from protein is about the same because we know lean mass dropped at approximately the same rate, so it makes sense that these numbers match. And then what we know is the fat loss was where the huge discrepancy existed. And here we see where that energy and water is coming from, and it's coming from the fat. This correlates to a lot of things. How you feel better on a dry fast than a water fast. Why? Because your body is producing excess energy because it's burning the fat faster. So you have more energy. And energy is one of the main things that make you feel down, depressed, going through the keto flu and a lot of other symptoms on a fast. And it's one of the main reasons why people quit and they feel like they can't fast. So the dry fast feels easier because the body is giving you a surplus of energy. It's crazy. It's a huge fasting hack. And then obviously we see where the water is coming from, the excess water, to keep us at a pretty good pace. However, I hope that you're not taking this information and thinking that you can dry fast forever. It is a balance. It is a scale. We do slowly dehydrate as the days go by. So it gets more dangerous the deeper you go. And that's where you have to balance the safety and the dangers and the benefits and the risks. That's where all the nuance and all the dry fasting caveats come into play. And you really have to watch out. That's really the beauty and the intricacy of a dry fast. Okay. And now what are we on? Last thing, metabolic rate. This is kind of self-explanatory. When you fast, your metabolic rate slowly goes down. It's not super crazy. And on a water fast here, we can see that it went down about 6%. And on a dry fast, about 10.7, almost double the amount compared to the water fast. What does that mean? Well, our body is getting that complete rest. This starts to talk about things like a complete fast versus an incomplete fast and why people say that a dry fast is the ultimate fast because it allows your body to really rest. Believe it or not, ingesting water doesn't let your body fully rest the way it gets to shut down its digestive system on a dry fast. But with that, you have to watch out because as it shuts down the digestive system quicker, we see that the BMR, the metabolic rate, goes down faster as well. This is why refeeding is so critical, so important on a dry fast. You may think that even a 1 or 2 day dry fast is nothing and you can take almost no precautions and just eat whatever the hell you want, but nothing could be further from the truth. Even after a 36-hour dry fast, you should refeed carefully. Yes, you don't have to go as crazy as a super long dry fast. I talk about it as an accordion window. For example, if you use my scorch protocol and I say, if you do a shorter fast, just imagine it as an accordion that gets squished. You still want to adhere to all of the principles, maybe in a smaller window, but you trust me, you'll be glad that you refeed correctly even after short dry fasts. So what was basically the conclusions of the study? It found that contrary to previous assumptions, protein catabolism sustains water balance. And it showed us that birds with access to water manage to maintain their fat reserves better than those without water. It suggests that water helps to conserve fat reserves, which are crucial for survival in dry conditions. This means that if you are water fasting, don't expect as much fat loss because water doesn't let you lose as much fat. And this is basically the explanation why dry fasting is more efficient. And to finish all of this up, thanks for bearing with me for such a long video. I'm really glad you're here. I'm really glad you're learning. And my dry fasting survival adaptation theory is in the article. You can read it if you want to. But the whole gist of it is, if I were to put it into a metaphor, our fat reserves are kind of like our life vest. And throughout history, we had to survive crazy environments, sicknesses. What if somebody was sick and they had to stay in their cave for a week or two? And they needed a method to survive. They needed a method to get water in the body, and they needed a method to basically help them heal. And dry fasting was that solution. The way I look at it is that fat is like our life vest. And we walk around with it because if we ever get into a pickle, that is going to let us survive. And we know that to a certain degree, but we haven't been aware that it will actually let us survive without water even. And I'm not even going to talk about the minerals and vitamins that are trapped in fat cells and actually get released during fasting. But the way I look at it is it's that life vest. And if you don't use your fat, you're basically walking around with this like loaded vest constantly. And it's kind of like a rain barrel. And the rain barrel's there for emergencies, but you need to drain it from time to time. And draining it could be like that drought experience. So what happens if we never refill that rain barrel? Basically, mosquitoes start hatching and it turns murky and nasty. And that's how I view our fat if you never fast and you don't go through these changes in the body, these co-evolution style adaptations that make us more efficient, regenerate our stem cells, keep us healthy. We need to filter and change it kind of like an oil change. We know we need to drink good water because we need to switch our water up, but we need to rotate our fat as well. I hope you agree with me, and I hope that this gives you more motivation to continue and learn about dry fasting and incorporate it into your life. As always, thank you for being here and good luck on your dry fasting journey. Thanks for sticking around. If you liked the video, leave a comment and share your ideas. And if you're looking for very detailed and unique protocols, check out the dryfastingclub.com. You'll find a lot there. You can even book a quick chat with me. There's also a free Discord link that you can find on the site, and I highly recommend you check out the forums and share your insights and experiences about dry fasting. You can kind of treat it like accountability, but really you can help a lot of other people. And as always, remember, no two people are the same, so every fasting experience is unique. Good luck on your dry fasting journey.